All right, the podcast is live. We are going to do the very brief, awkward pause of stare at each other and start to wait for our viewers to sign in. Always our favorite part. All right. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to this edition of Talent War Group podcast. Just always very, very grateful for everyone taking the time to join us and participate in our discussions here. So the panel that we have today, myself, Dan Bradley, I am a software graduate, former Air Force JTAC, and current director of sales here at Con Mechanical Contractors in lovely Dallas, Texas. We will soon be joined by Mike Sarraille, the man himself. Mike, for those of you who are unfamiliar, where have you been? He is a former Recon Marine and U.S. Navy SEAL, founder and CFO of the elite executive search firm, EF Overwatch, co-author of Amazon bestseller, The Talent War. Go out and get your copy if you haven't already. Founder of the Talent War Group, and more recently, contributor to Men's Journal. He's got a new column, The Everyday Warrior, and Speak of the Devil, Mike Sarraille. Also joining us today, Talent War Group member Mike Hertzendorf. Mike, am I pronouncing your last name right here? All right, Mike is a former U.S. Army aviator and commander, served in SOCOM as well as with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Also served as Chief of Staff of the 82nd Airborne. Previously served as CEO of New Air, which is a UAS and aeronautical research, development, safety, and consulting company, and currently the Vice President of Member Services with Helicopter Association International. We've got Michelle joining us today, intern with Talent War Group and EF Overwatch. Michelle, always good to see you. And behind the scenes, we've got Will Sharman making the magic happen. So thank you all for joining us. First and foremost, who are we? What is the Talent War Group? So the Talent War Group is really just an organization of experts who share our lessons learned and our insights on talent management, leadership, organizational development, and everything along those lines. So our team is comprised of individuals with experiences in the most elite tiers of military operations and the highest levels of private industry. Some people, like our panelists today, have experience in both. And all the members of the Talent War Group share one common goal, and that's to help your team win through effectively managing your most important asset, your organization's most important asset, which is your talent. So we do rely on your support to grow, and we wouldn't be here without it. If you like what you hear, share it with your connections and your contacts, and always feel free to reach out and connect with any of our team members to find out what we can bring to the table for your organization. And while you're at it, go ahead and follow us on LinkedIn for more insights from our team. You don't want to miss the upcoming content. If you do have questions or comments, please send them through the chat function, and we're going to do our best to address them as we move through today's session. So today we're talking about risk mitigation through strategic management. Now, risk mitigation is something that you already do naturally to some extent every single day. You've taken risks today, you've successfully mitigated them through just your own individual processes. And it's something that when it works well, it goes unnoticed. But when it works poorly, it becomes painfully evident very, very quickly. So before we get too deep into the conversation and bring in some interesting perspectives from our panel, let's break down the subject just a little bit. So first of all, what is risk? I'll take the cop-out approach here and default to the basic dictionary definition. A risk is a person or thing regarded as likely to turn out well or poorly as specified in a particular context or respect. All right, so what that means is there can be good risk, even though it often has a negative connotation. And we'll talk about that as the conversation develops. Second, what is mitigation? Well, really it's just taking steps to reduce the severity or something or to reduce your exposure to it. Not to eliminate it, just to mitigate it. And third, what is strategic management? Well, it's making informed decisions based on known information and educated guesses on unknown information, what we would call assumptions, to achieve a desired outcome. So if you put it all together, what we're really talking about is reducing your vulnerability to a potential threat through well-informed and data-driven decision-making processes. So there are plenty of well-known cases of this process going wrong, and I often find value in tying in some of those prominent examples that everybody is aware of. So I'm going to talk about the Challenger disaster in 1986. Now, Space Shuttle tragically exploded, more accurately probably disintegrated, roughly a minute into its flight, which led to the death of 7 astronauts. So what became known or referred to as the cause of this disaster was a faulty O-ring, basically a piece of equipment that's supposed to act as a seal in a rocket booster. Now, as the most immediate traceable cause, or the proximate cause of the disaster, the O-ring has kind of become part of the tragedy's lore. But I'm going to argue that the O-ring didn't really cause the disaster. The disaster was caused by poor risk mitigation. So that launch, just some background on it, it took place in near freezing temperatures. If memory serves properly, it was about 36 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the lowest ever temperature for a NASA space shuttle launch. Now that was a known issue, and some engineers believe that it may put the shuttle at risk. Now NASA measures a lot of things and decided to move forward with the launch in part because the data that they referred to, which they had measured the likelihood of total shuttle failure, indicated a 1 in 100,000 chance of failure. Pretty safe odds there. Now the data they should have factored in, but did not, is the likelihood of O-ring specific failure as a result of temperature and environmental conditions. Now that likelihood came out to between 6% and 13%, depending on the study you want to reference. Now taking a risk based on a 1 in 100,000 chance is a whole lot different from taking a risk on a 1 in 8 chance, especially when something as important as lives are on the line. So in other words, the O-ring didn't really cause the disaster. It was the proximate cause. But failure to mitigate risk through well-informed and data-driven decision-making processes did. Now I want to bring two books to everyone's attention. Some of these books might not be immediately known to you, but the terms probably are. The first one is The Black Swan by Nicholas Taleb. And basically what he argues is that risks that he would call black swans are highly improbable or outliers, or risks that you can't anticipate because you didn't even know that they existed. Now, kind of the antithesis of that book is The Gray Rhino by Michelle Wooker. And that book argues the exact opposite. It says that there's obvious risks that for whatever reason, we discount, we neglect, and then we act surprised when the risk disrupts us. So in the Challenger case, measuring the proper data to make risk mitigating decisions would have revealed that gray rhino. But it's funny because people and organizations spend so much time trying to seek out black swans that they ignore gray rhinos that are staring them directly in the face. So let's bring the focus back a little bit to a business application, specifically regarding talent. And I am not an expert in this. There are people on this panel who definitely are. And I'm about to hand it over to them, but I want to tie together this opening kind of monologue with this. A good risk, or a risk worth taking, presents both a threat and an opportunity. And this is where the strategic management part comes in. If, based on the assumptions and known information, the opportunity is greater than the threat, then the risk may be worth taking. But you still have to find ways to mitigate that threat. You can plan, you can measure the right data, you can commit resources, you can develop ways to influence circumstances, create redundancies, activate safeguards, institute left and right limits. There's a lot that you can do. Risk isn't really avoidable, but failure to mitigate risk is reckless, and recklessness is eventually going to catch up to you. So now that I've kind of belabored that point, love to open it back up to Mike and Mike. Gentlemen.
Well, I will always defer to Mike Hertzendorf, given the nature of what he did in the military. He's got so many more variables that they had to assess than we did on the ground. Dan, I like how you sort of summarized it. You ignore things that you think aren't a big risk at first, or you're hit from the blind side by something that you didn't even consider. This is where experience comes into play, is that you start to see all these different scenarios and contingencies, and you build your little repertoire of potential risks and what could potentially, take a mission sideways. Risk is inherent in everything we do. And while it can be mitigated, it cannot be eliminated. Now, what I think the special operations community does a very good job of, and actually screens for, is assessing how people view risk. And they do cultivate this in the environment, is that we actually start to look at risk from the upside. No risk, no reward. Other people, and what I've seen in the business world, even in the military is not immune to this, is that some people are crippled by risk. They see risk and all they see is fear, and then they're sort of thrown into paralysis through analysis, looking at that risk. They can't move past it, and hence can't come up with a simple plan and move it into the execution phase. I will say this, we really boiled down risk to two things in the military. One, it was risk to mission, if that sounds familiar to Dan. I know it does to Mike, and then risk to personnel. What are the potential risks to the outcomes of the mission? And hence, are we going to engage in contingency planning? What measures are we going to take, like countless rehearsals, the depth and breadth of our planning? And the rehearsals were a way that we drove down risk to the lowest level possible. And sometimes that meant doing rehearsals both during the day and then sort of graduating to night for a series of days or weeks before ever executing on that mission. In the large profile missions that the American public has seen, usually people were behind the scenes rehearsing those missions for weeks, if not months. And then the risk to personnel. Is the risk to personnel worth the reward? And that's really, I can't give people an answer, sort of a formula to follow. That depends on the strategic nature of the mission. And there were times that we operated outside of safety parameters, but due to the strategic nature of the mission, we were willing to accept that risk because the outcomes could have strategic impacts for our nation, for our companies. It doesn't matter. Let me turn it over to Mike, because I know he has a lot of experience mitigating and assessing risk in his realm.
Hey, thanks, Mike. And, Dan, fantastic intro. And I'm going to touch on some of the things that Mike just mentioned. As we're talking about risk management here, we're sort of talking about it specifically towards let's just say towards, the talent within your organization. And it's strategic management, but it's also strategic leadership. And I think where that's really going to start is, and this is the same as in businesses and in the military, and I'll relate most of this to business. It starts with the CEO. In the military, we call the commander's intent, but that CEO still has a vision, and he still has a direction that he wants to take that company. And so that has to be communicated throughout the organization, throughout the breadth and depth. And a lot of times that's hard in very large, complex organizations. But in order to mitigate risk, the first thing that needs to be known is the intent of that commander or CEO. And that needs to permeate throughout the organization. And then, and this goes into development of culture, and both Mike and Dan have hit on this, there has to be an acceptance to take risks, but the acceptance really has to be, you're going to have to accept failure. And so as you're assessing the risk, you also have to assess what those failures would be. And are they going to be at a tactical, operational, or strategic level? And as you educate people, they will begin to understand where are those decisions need to be made and what can they do to contribute to providing the right facts and data and assumptions so that the risk can be mitigated, but could also be accepted. And then I think as employees are looking to assess risk, you have to put it in some lens of, is this relationship to the organization? Is this reputational to the organization? Is it financial? Does it deal with customers? Does it deal with products? And so there's sort of two main levers. I think it's understanding what level that risk is going to be at, who's it going to relate to, and what's the acceptance of making that decision at your level, or does it have to be elevated because maybe you don't have all the appropriate resources to mitigate that risk, so you have to elevate it, but you have to do it in a way that is non-emotional, that is based on the facts, the assumptions, and the data that you have. I'll turn it back to Mike or Dan for thoughts on that.
Mike, I'm always interested as we potentially kick off a podcast here with yourself and some fellow commanders and E9s, is the conversations you guys have regarding risk. And I know sometimes when we think risk is high, the commanders pull to the side and they have that heart-to-heart as they're gauging whether this is worth it or not. And I know it's a tough decision when you call a mission off for which guys are emotionally detached, but you're making the right call, and you explain why. To put this into business context, what I often hear working with Fortune 500s is that there's a fear, and this goes back to leadership and sort of, again, leadership encouraging people to innovate and adapt, which means assuming risk, trying new things. But in corporate culture, sometimes what I hear is that people are so afraid to accept risk because if they fail, that leadership comes down on them too aggressively. And so let me tell a quick story. I had the pleasure of knowing Bill Campbell. I grew up in Silicon Valley. If the listeners don't know who Bill Campbell is, he was known as the secret coach of Silicon Valley, or the $1 Trillion Coach is a book that's written about him. And he was this old football coach, born in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania, played Division I, became a Division I coach, and then made the leap over to the private sector, and eventually became the CEO of Intuit. He mentored Sergey Brin, a lot of the Silicon Valley greats, and he was telling a story about when he led a division or was leading Intuit, and one of his senior leaders took some calculated risk, and that may be worth talking about. Mike and Dan is calculated risk versus just sort of reckless action. But one of his senior leaders took calculated risks with an initiative, a project, rolled it out. It didn't work in his favor. And everyone thought that Bill was just going to bring the world down in the sky and, as we say, just fire him and let him go. And Bill knew he had an opportunity. And he actually came in and praised the individual for accepting that risk, even though it didn't work out in his favor, and made it seem like a victory. And what he, the reason is, he was telling me the story, the reason he did that was to create or foster a culture that was willing to accept risk, embrace failure, understanding that's what it takes to gain more market share, to put a better product or service into the market. So let me turn it over to Dan and Mike for any comments on that.
I'll take one because Mike, you made a comment that was so near and dear to my heart when I was in the military, and I'll be honest, I almost forgot about it now. And so, right now we are going through COVID. It's been 9 months. What a great time to talk about risk for organizations in relation to what's going on right now. And the company I'm with now is looking to plan a big live event. And of course, everyone's like, how are you planning this live event now? And they're all thinking of the risks. What if someone gets sick? What if people don't come? But we see it as an opportunity to forge a way ahead for what the future is going to look like. And your comment, Mike, and this came from my favorite SEALs, was you cannot dwell on your success and you have to embrace your failures. And that right there sets up the culture that we've been talking about that will allow people to be comfortable enough to make decisions knowing that if there is some failure, it will not come back to them. And that's where that acceptance of risk is so important. Now, once again, you have to put it in the right lens. It has to be mitigated. You have to know it. And it has to be made at the right level, because often, as Mike pointed out in the military, we were concerned with tactical kind of functions, but we all knew they had strategic consequences. And that's the same right now in business. An email could go out from a company to another company, from an individual, and that could almost set policy, and that email could get passed around, and that could become a policy issue. And so that could become very strategic. And so I think the same situations apply right now with how COVID is changing everything. And it's forcing leaders to learn to and place a culture within their organizations that are going to allow them to pivot, be nimble, be flexible, and make it through, this business crisis.
Yeah, I love that, Mike. Just embracing failures, being able to learn from them. Part of that is just what sets successful organizations apart, because learning from those failures and turning them into positive experiences, how you get better at taking risks. That's how you evolve. That's how you become more intelligent with how you're going to lead your team. We got a question here from Tony Long. Should the first step of risk mitigation be training? That should help cut out that fear, correct? So Tony, that's a really good question, and I think that there's a couple of risk mitigation approaches that we should probably go over. So in general, it's kind of accepted or kind of common to refer to 4 risk mitigation approaches. One is to avoid it. In other words, to stop or exit or leave whatever you're doing. And that brings about separate repercussions of its own. But if you have no tolerance for risk, you just avoid it. The exact opposite of that is accepting it, basically saying, hey, no factor, we're just going to continue to move forward. Third is to transfer it. In my industry, that's pretty common. Passing it on to another entity, whether it's a subcontractor or a partner or something else who's involved in the situation, or you can control it. Now, those 4 approaches aren't mutually exclusive, but in any case, you're still dealing with the risk. You're not ignoring it. I think that training is an important first step towards risk mitigation. And, Mike Sarraille brought up a great example of just what we do when we're mission planning in the military and we're going through rehearsals. I'm sure that there's parallels in the aviation world as well, like chair flying. I believe that's a common term. You can correct me on that, Mike. But training is the first step towards any degree of success in the organization, because you can't operate without people who are on the same page, without people who possess the requisite skills to actually go out and conduct a mission or to reach a goal from an organizational perspective. So I would say that training is the bare bones foundation of making sure that everyone's on the same page and able to understand what's about to happen, able to take steps to mitigate that risk in the long term. Mike, anything to add or challenge?
Part of this process, we conduct these for our audience, is we're also learning as well. I've got my book here. One, I'm going to answer this actually using Mike's point from earlier, and actually I wrote it down. Is it actually starts with understanding what you're tasked with doing. He called it the commander's intent and the desired outcomes. So if you know you're training for a particular or ready to step onto a certain mission or engage in a certain project or a product rollout, you got to understand what you're doing and what you're hoping to achieving, and then start the training process. What training is required to accomplish that mission? Training, again, in the depth to which you take it and make it as realistic as possible, will mitigate your risk. But we are very good about sitting down and talking through each phase. We call them missions, you call them projects. We break them down into phases for a purpose, that they're in chunkable little sizes. So that I know my first phase, let's call that, we're going to insert. We're going to train specifically to that phase to make sure that we're prepared, that our skill levels where it needs to be to execute that phase. We're going to talk about the contingencies that can potentially happen during that first phase. Now, when you talk about contingencies, guys, we can actually have that conversation about each of these phases for weeks. So you've got to really break down those contingencies to what is realistically going to happen, and make sure that you don't go too far. If not, then the opportunity is going to pass you by. But the training is severely going to mitigate the risk. We're not going to send a young SEAL platoon into a situation that's well beyond their capability. We're going to assume more risk there. But maybe there's this SEAL platoon over here that has more combat deployments under their belt, and that alone, their skill level and their experience level may reduce the risk to where it's acceptable to send them on that endeavor. So the training is a good very important point, Tony. You're not going to send a young employee who's not trained to the standard to execute a task. You're accepting way too much risk.
I think you're muted there, Dan.
The joys of technology. Thank you very much, Mike. Mike, unless you have anything to add to the first question, we've got another one here from Robert. How do you deal with people that are afraid to pull the trigger?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So to me, I would think there is probably a trust issue potentially that person is, you have to say, why is that person not willing to pull the trigger? And I think, by business, not make a decision. And so I think what I would sort of question is, what's the level of trust between that person and the leadership? And then you sort of have to maybe even break down trust a little bit. What does it mean if you trust someone? If I trust Mike Sarraille, I have a belief that he will be able to do what he says he's going to do reliably when he says he's going to do it for the right reasons in the right way. And so if you use that as a basis to assess, why is that individual not willing to make a decision? The first question I would ask is he been empowered? Does he trust his leadership? And empowerment's a two-way street, right? I think often we think of it as empowerment just works down, that, a leader empowers a subordinate, but that subordinate can empower his leaders. And it's that basis of trust that allows then the leader to look up. So I think, in answer to that question, the first thing I would ask is there a lack of trust in that relationship, or what does that person believe would be the consequences? So I hope that that answered the question for Robert.
And Mike, I'm sure you've had to do this as a commander. Personally, am I confident I can execute the things I say I'm going to execute? But is there always this question in the back of my mind as a leader, like, hey, am I prepared? Have I done everything in my power to mitigate the risk to the lowest level? And I'm sure you have, in terms of mentoring young combat aviators, have had to not hold their hand, but reinforce that, hey, listen, I've watched you. You've done the risk mitigation. You've done your due diligence. You've taken your element out there and trained. You are prepared for this. You guys are ready to execute. I don't know if that strikes hold, or your guys were so well trained by the time they got to you that wasn't a problem.
No, I think that's a great question. Everyone looks at aviation because aviation is an inherently risky business, right? When an airplane or a helicopter stops to fly, something bad is going to happen. But the converse to that is aviation is also a very, and I'll use the word rigid. You have to have standards and discipline in your operations, your training, and your maintenance. So then I would ask, okay, aviation being inherently risky, inherently has the processes in place. Do your organizations that you may not view as risky still have those right processes in place to understand what the standards are, to train to them, and then embed that in the culture? And so, of course, aviation being inherently risky, we're always concerned, and you always run through numbers of, courses of action. And something that I think also relates to business now, and we used it in the military, is, the courses of action they relate to the enemy. And in this case, in business, the enemy could be numbers of things. It could be competitors. It could be the marketplace. But what's the most dangerous and what's the most likely courses of action or contingencies that you think could go wrong or will go wrong? And then you address those. And so that provides that framework for assessment of the risks. What is likely to happen? What would be necessary to mitigate it? But not just how likely, how severe. And that gives you sort of the capability to assess risk as well.
Hey, Dan, one thing we're not talking about is we're assuming we're talking about risk leading into an endeavor, again, whether in the business world or the military. One subject that we're sort of not discussing is, as a leader, when somebody took all the right steps off on that endeavor, but fails, how do we coach them as leaders to ensure that they don't develop this risk aversion from stepping back into the arena? And I'm racking my brain of trying to think of some times like that, but that's a big concern, is that if I see one of my junior subordinate leaders fail, but I know they did all the right steps, maybe they just didn't account for something that I wouldn't even thought of. How do I get in there and make sure that I help them learn from the process and actually embolden them to step back in the arena and engage? I'll throw that at you guys. That just sort of hit me.
Yeah, Mike, that's awesome. There's been plenty of times in my career, I'm sure, in just about anybody's, where you take a risk and you think you've done everything right. You've done the planning, you've measured the right data, you're confident in your plan, and then you step off and it just very quickly does not go the way you thought it would. Taking a risk that doesn't pan out doesn't mean it was a bad risk. There's a lot of things at play in just about any situation. That includes things beyond your scope of influence. It also doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue taking risks as long as they're responsible risks. So, we touched on this a little bit earlier. The failure is incredibly valuable. Taking lessons learned from failed risks and accepting that you're now smarter and more capable because you learned those lessons allows you to build that knowledge into your future ventures. And it makes the risk that you're about to take, the next step and the next step and the next step, more valid risks. It means that you're going to approach it from a more intelligent standpoint and a more firm background. It's interesting how this is playing out in the comments section. We've got kind of an antithesis sort of question. How do you deal with individuals that take too many risks? So the first question was, how do you deal with people who aren't willing to take any risks? And I think that we've done a good job of kind of capturing the trust that's involved in that. What's the exact opposite? How do you deal with somebody who's not going to take any risks?
All right, so I think since I answered the first one, I'll take the opposite. So I think you have to assess, when it's in that personal relationship, why is that person taking those risks? Is it, their own personal beliefs? Is it, the fact that they think it's what's best for the organization? And so I think, it really just is going to depend on why is that person doing that? And maybe you just have to sit and educate, right? As you said, I don't fail, I always learn. Maybe there's a missing component of education there that the person doesn't understand the consequences of their actions. So I think once again, you really have to develop those personal relationships and understand why is that person doing what he's doing, and think, okay, have I enabled that behavior? Have I caused that to happen? And you also just can't look at the individual. You have to look at yourself and what you've done that could potentially have allowed that behavior to occur.
So this brings into mind, there's a book written about a guy named Adam Brown. It's called Fearless. And Adam had this attribute, he was fearless. It wasn't always a good thing. And I don't want to say this isn't degrading Adam whatsoever. He just didn't have a more a process to really just take one step back, assess risk quickly, and then make a decision. If he saw a burning building, he just started running towards the burning building. As we say in the special operations communities, I believe it was General Brown back in the day, he said, run to the sounds of gunfire. Yes, we believe that, but you're also assessing the situation and making a decision based off the information you have to mitigate risk in a matter of seconds and take action. So this could be, and again, I don't know the full context, that this individual just doesn't have a system for which to mitigate risk. They see opportunity and they just run towards it rather than taking that, again, as we say in the special operations community or the military, a tactical need to assess a situation, gather as much information in a timely manner, orient the OODA loop that Major John Boyd from the Air Force, a combat aviator, developed, orient themselves, look at the information, make a decision, and then act. And so you may have to sit them down and ask them, again, always be curious, not judgmental. Hey, why do you make decisions the way you make decisions? So that's one approach. I also agree with Mike. It's just when Mike was talking, I automatically think of those guys, and we have our share of them in the special operations communities that just run. They have too much of a bias for action. Hey, Dan, and I know we got one more question. We'll get to Lisa's question here, because there's something about the aviation community that I highly respect, is that they use incidents that don't necessarily work out in their favor to mitigate risk in the future. And I know they are very, very deliberate and intensive about their incident investigations as a means not to point fingers and cast blame, but to identify the root causes of the problem and then make sure that those root problems, along with recommendations, are spread enterprise-wide to mitigate risk going into the future. Mike, am I accurate in that? Is that something we could touch on real quick?
No, absolutely, Mike. And I think, once again, that's a culture that translates to an organization. When someone makes a mistake or has an accident or does something that, causes a negative consequence, how do you use that to not just better yourself, but better all your teammates and potentially even, better some of your you could call them competing organizations, right? Because in certain industries, everyone has to work together, and the better that industry is doing, the better that each individual entity within it may do. And so I think aviation did a very good job of trying to share information across the enterprise, because they realized it's good for everyone, even if it may benefit in business your competitor. If it helps the industry along, everyone will be better off. Sort of the rising tide raises all ships. And I would be remiss if I didn't go back to one of Mike's comments as he was talking about we always wanted people who were willing to move towards the sound of the guns, but we want them to be smart enough to not run to their death in a gunfight. And so just, Mike's comments brought back another one of those famed analogies. But I think it aptly describes how you want people that are innovative and bold, but you also want them to be smart at the same time.
Yeah, just building off of points from both of you guys, risk management can't be just a passive activity or something that your organization sort of does sometimes when they feel like it or when things go wrong. It's got to be this committed, active, influential role. And I wouldn't say, or I'd be lying if I didn't say I smiled a little bit when Mike Sarraille brought up Colonel Boyd. Always love it when we get a little bit of Air Force love in the conversation. That OODle loop, the thing about it is it doesn't stop. That's why it's the OODle loop. It always goes right back to the very beginning. And you're always re-observing, you're always reorienting, then deciding and acting based on new information, because the process you've just gone through has changed everything about the situation. And I can only imagine from a pilot's perspective, you're in a situation where everything is constantly changing all the time, not just the data about how you're flying, where you're flying, what your systems are doing, but the combat situation around you is in such flux all the time that you don't have an opportunity. You cannot afford to step back from that loop. Would that be kind of a safe assumption?
Very, very safe. Hey, there's a great question, Dan. I'll read this off from our own Lisa Jaster. And how do you approach teams to your left and right that may have a different risk tolerance, but you need to collaborate? I'll open that up to the group. I have my own thoughts based off just past experiences.
I'll take a quick stab at it, but I'd obviously love to hear yours, Mike. I think, and it's a very relevant question, because in today, most organizations are networked, right? They're not necessarily, the traditional hierarchical organizations. And so as you're working in a networked organization, I think creating that shared understanding of the problem, shared consciousness, as I've heard it called. So everyone really understands that complex situation the same way. And then you can have those discussions on what are those risks and the impacts. But I think it really begins with ensuring that everyone has the appropriate lens, that they're looking at the problem the same way. And then you have to understand the differences in the lenses from those organizations to your left, to your right, so you can mitigate them. But I think it really starts with a shared understanding of the problem or the environment that you're facing.
So go ahead, Dan. Okay, I'll shoot. So Lisa, this brought up something that I saw when I was in the SEAL teams. And sometimes we work with Army ODAs, Special Forces communities. And sometimes, from our perception, if the ODA, the Army SF team, had more experience in the task we were tasked with, that sort of profile, it would seem like they were running 100 miles an hour while we were in the slow lane. And it seemed like they were accepting more risk. And really, sometimes it was due to that lack of relationship. But as we got into conversations, there's a give and take. Let's say the speed of execution was too fast for us during a certain phase. They would actually say, okay, hey, let's slow down that to make sure that we're mitigating risk, that you guys are comfortable. And the same thing, there were times that we were executing sniper operations where an ODA was focused on direct action raids for that deployment. And then all of a sudden they're thrown into the sniper realm where we've been doing it for months. Again, I love how Mike said the lens. We're like, hey, we got to step back. That this isn't what they've been doing. They're trained to do this mission. they've been out of this mission profile for a few months, and we'd have to give and take to put them into their comfort zone or educate them on why we weren't actually accepting risk based off our experience running mission profile after mission profile for months. So sometimes it is a lack of experience. It can be a lack of relationships. And all I'll say is give and take. If you need to slow down your speed of execution during certain phases for them to feel more comfortable, that's fine. If you need to be a little more intrusive, and I call it hand holding during certain phases of the project rollout, then do that. But you've got to be conscious of the fact that it comes down to relationships and experience, and weigh those two.
Yeah, I wish I had something to add. The same lens thing is fantastic, but often you can look through the same lens from a different perspective. So I 100% agree with both of you gentlemen. Common ground, building relationships, and just breeding a shared understanding of what we're about to do, but not only that, how we're about to do it. As long as you're on the same page moving forward with that, you're setting yourself up for success. Lisa, always good to hear from you. Team, are we ready to tie it together here with saved rounds? All right. Mike Hertzendorf, anything that you'd like to wrap up on?
I think I made most of my points, but I really always enjoy the conversation with you, Dan and Mike, because you bring up some fantastic points, and it challenges me to learn and look at things differently. And I've been sitting here taking notes now, wondering, am I appropriately, assessing the risks in my organization, and how am I looking to do those things that I said, that I've done in the past. That, it's hard. You get busy in your day-to-day life, and you just sort of forget to take that step back and think and look at things differently. So it's great education for me, and I appreciate, Dan and Mike and your time.
Mike, same to you. Mike Sarraille.
One last thing is, and Mike is making me reminisce. He's got a lot more experience than I do, but I remember we were tasked with a mission, and we were so emotionally tasked because this mission was sexy. If we pulled it off, it was going to be awesome. And it was a wise, what we call a master chief in the Navy. He was a SEAL master chief in E9. And he listened to our entire mission briefing, and he said, the only thing I'll say, and this individual he was highly respected, had been in an incident in Afghanistan in the early days, which is called Robert's Ridge. And so we highly respected him. He didn't talk much. He was a wise old man. He said, hey, don't confuse your enthusiasm with your capability. And at first, we all had an allergic reaction to that. And we thought, oh, this guy's, maybe he's not who we thought he was. Maybe he's not as aggressive as we initially thought. And as we were young, we looked in the mirror. We're like, oh no, that's not what he's saying. He's just he's telling us, make sure you can follow through on the things that you said you can execute, and that you're mitigating risk. And guess what? We had to go back and make changes to that plan. I think this little risk bag and truly having respect for it grows as you gain experience. Same thing, moving from special operations to now the business world. I've made mistakes to which I go to mentors and they laugh. They're like, oh, I could have told you not to do that one. You accepted way too much risk on that. I'm new to this game. I'm new. And so I'm accumulating the business risk and trying to pair it with military risk. They're all the same, but I've got to get my worth of scars and scuffs to the face to grow within this realm.
And Mike, I suppose both Mikes here, that's two of my favorite things about being part of this group and watching how this organization is developing is, one, I'm learning something every single time that we're communicating. We have some incredible people here that I just love learning from. I've got pages of notes from this conversation, and I can't wait to go back through them. But also, Mike Sarraille, what you said is you got plenty of scars that you're kind of able to learn from. That's really what this is all about, is being open, being vulnerable, and sharing not just the successes. There's no success without failure, and I think that everybody who's here is more than happy to talk about the failures they've been through. Hey, for myself, my saved round, we've talked a lot about risk aversion today, and risk aversion, simply put, is just being uncomfortable with uncertainty, which to a degree is fine. It's actually a normal human tendency. But in its most extreme form, it's a willingness to be stagnant. It's acceptance of the status quo. And I can't think of any team or organization or person that has ever done great things while being completely risk averse without taking risks. So risk mitigation is not risk avoidance, two very different things. And mitigation is, I mean, we could have tons and tons of conversation on this. We could create hours of content. This is not all encompassing, but really enjoyed the conversation and picking up some new insights on today. Michelle.
Yes. Thank you everybody for having me. No, thank you everybody for having me. This was a really interesting conversation. So in summary, I had the top 3 points from this conversation. The first one was by Dan Bradley. In his introduction, he said that if based on assumptions, the opportunity is bigger than the threat, then the threat may be worth it. So this requires you to analyze and take in everything that you know about your environment that you're about to take on and ask yourself if the failure that you may end up with is worth it. And then the second point was by Mike Hertzendorf. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but that if taking a risk that does not pan out, that does not mean it was a bad risk. So taking a learned lesson from a failure does not make it a failure. Again, this goes back to analyzing your environment before and after you take on a risk. Have you taken a risk like this before? And if yes, what did you learn from it? And how can you approach it this time? And then the last point was by Mike Sarraille. He said that without a risk, there is no reward. So this morning we had our training actually by Mike, where we spoke about laziness and how it's our human nature to be lazy and comfortable. But if we do this, we don't take risk and we keep ourselves from growing.
And Dan, Mike, I think you'll appreciate this. Q1, Michelle is got a lot of potential for EF Overwatch as a whole. We're making everyone come in at 8:30, which is 30 minutes prior to when they need to be in, and we're going through training, leadership training, industry experience training. A lot of business leaders think that you never have time to train. You've got to make time, and you guys know this well from the military. So we're following. I'm taking a page from what I've been taught from my military leaders, and we're trying to engage, even if it's 30 minutes a day. I think that's going to elevate the performance of our young subordinate leaders to a level that basically our competitors can't match. So I thought you guys would appreciate that, and we'll reassess at the end of Q1 to see if it's improved our performance.
Mike, that's awesome. And Michelle, thank you very much. Guys, we're going to wrap this up for today. I just want to give a pitch real quick. Tomorrow is our next podcast, January 13th. It's going to be 1 p.m. Central. Topic is leadership, organizations, and the COVID-19 vaccination. I don't think it gets a whole lot more timely than that. So that's going to be led by our very own Chris Froy. He's going to be joined by Mike Sarraille, and it's going to feature a special guest, Leonard Ajiti. Leonard, I'll apologize in advance for that one. He's a professor of medicine and eminent scholar, chief, division of general internal medicine director, associate director for diversity, genomic sciences, and precision medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin. If there's anybody that you guys know who has more valid and quality content on this topic, I would really hate to meet that person. I don't think that we could have a better guest on for that session. Guys, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. If you like what you heard and you want to continue the conversation, connect with us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Share all of our posts and any of these sessions with your organizations, your connections, your family, your friends, your neighbors, but most importantly, follow the Talent War Group. You want to improve yourself, your team, your organization. Any of our team members are available to work directly with you to help you and your organization find success. So to close it out, check out thetalentwar.com and efoverwatch.com to learn more. Guys, thank you very much for joining us today. Awesome panel, awesome discussion. Looking forward to the next one.